Iranians are voting to elect a new president, with all but one of the four candidates regarded as hardliners. The winner will replace incumbent Hassan Rouhani, a relative moderate who's served the maximum 2 terms. Dissidents and some reformists have called for a boycott, saying that the barring of several contenders has removed any genuine competition. The elections come at a time of widespread discontent among Iranians over economic hardships. However, there is widespread apathy among voters after 3 years of crippling sanctions reinstated by the United States when it abandoned a nuclear deal between world powers and Iran. Elections also coincide with the latest round of talks in Vienna aimed at reviving the accord, which saw Iran agree to limit its nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. Almost 600 hopefuls, including 40 women, registered for the election. But in the end, only 7 men were approved last month by the 12 jurists and theologians on the Hardline Guardian Council, an unelected body that has the ultimate decision with regard to candidates' qualifications. 3 of these have since dropped out. So who were the original 7 candidates? Let's find out.
Anti-Western supreme leader. In the Islamic Republic's dual system of republican and clerical rule, the president heads the government but reports to the supreme leader, the country's top authority. Clerical officials who vetted the candidates rejected several prominent moderates and conservatives, resulting in a field of 5 hardliners and 2 low-key moderates. Let's take a look at who they are. The frontrunner is Ebrahim Raisi, a hardline judge seen by insiders as representing the security establishment at its most fearsome. Washington described him as a member of Khamenei's inner circle. He was sanctioned by the US for human rights abuses, including the 1980s executions of thousands of political prisoners. Iran has never acknowledged the mass executions, and Raisi himself has never publicly addressed allegations about his role. Saeed Jalili, a hardline diplomat, is fiercely loyal to Khamenei. He lost his right leg in the 1980s when fighting for the elite Revolutionary Guards in the Iran-Iraq War. Jalili served as secretary of the Supreme National Security Council for 5 years, a position that automatically made him chief negotiator on nuclear affairs. Abdul Nasser Hemati is a former ambassador to China and a pragmatist technocrat who had served as Iran's central bank chief since 2018 for 3 years. Mohsen Rezai was top commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, who led the elite force during the 8-year Iran-Iraq War. Mohsen Meralizadeh is a former governor of Iran's Isfahan province. The moderate politician was elected as first vice president in 2001. Ali Reza Zakani is a hardline lawmaker who was disqualified in 2013 and 2017 from running for president. He holds a PhD in nuclear medicine and has portrayed himself as the most capable candidate at fighting poverty and corruption. Amir Hossein Ghazizadeh Hashemi has been a member of parliament since 2008. The hardline politician has promised to boost Iran's battered economy.
Iranians are voting at a pivotal time for the country, both at home and abroad. Much has changed in the 4 years since the last election, and our following infographic presents the key reasons why this election is closely watched. Iranians have been voting in a presidential election which is likely to be won by a hardline candidate, though many ignored the ballots amid a call for a boycott by the critics.
Iranians on Friday went to the polls to elect their new president amid anger over economic hardship and calls for a boycott by critics. Senior officials appealed for a large turnout in an election widely seen as a referendum on their handling of mounting economic and social pressures, including rising prices and unemployment and a collapse in the value of its currency. Long queues were seen at polling stations in several cities. After voting in the capital, Tehran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei urged Iranians to cast ballots.
با حضور مردم کشور و نظام جمهوری اسلامی هم امتیازات بزرگی رو در عرصه بین المللی به دست میاره. لکن اون که اول منتفع می شود از این رأی دادن خود مردم. بیایید و تشخیص بدید و انتخاب کنید و رأی بدید.
Voters have expressed mixed views.
انتظار مثل همه مردم اول حل مسئله اقتصادی و معیشتیه، بعد مسئله ویروس کرونا و واکسیناسیون و تا حدودی هم اشتغال جوونا رو بذارن تو دستور کارشون خوبه.
ما با انتخابات مشکل نداریم، با کشورمون با نظاممون مشکل نداریم، اما این سفره زیبنده مردم ایران نبوده. این مشکلات باید یک جای قیچی میشد.
Under pressure over inflation and joblessness at about 39% and 11% respectively, the new president needs a high vote count to boost legitimacy, damaged after a series of protests against poverty and political curbs since 2017. New sanctions by the United States slashed Iran's oil exports from 2.8 million barrels per day in 2018 to as low as an estimated 200,000 BPD in some months of 2020. Although volumes have since crept up, Iran's currency, the rial, has lost 70% in value since 2018.
So today is the presidential election in Iran. A field of 4 candidates, down from the 7 original candidates that were selected for the election today. It's now been reduced to 4. So this evening we're going to be in this program we're going to be talking about the background to the elections, what effects that the elections will have on Iran, and whether or not it will change Iran's foreign policy, and how, of course, this will impact on the ongoing negotiations in Vienna for the nuclear deal, which the Trump administration withdrew from 3 years ago, whether or not they want to rejoin and how they can rejoin. Of course, Iran at this time has tremendous economic difficulties, and these are things that the elections are going to be looking at today, because the people are wanting a change. One of the consequences of this is that the people, by and large, are not expected to turn out for the elections. Whilst in 1979 there was a 73% turnout for Iran's last presidential election. Sorry, in 2017 there was a 73% turnout. Today, polls are suggesting that only 42% turnout will happen. As the country votes in this crucial presidential election, Iran's tattered nuclear deal with world powers hangs in the balance.
But how close it is to a weapon or to accumulating enough highly enriched uranium for a weapon is a sliding scale. And I think from the Iranian escalation playbook here, there are steps it can take in terms of experimenting with new advanced centrifuges, which would grant its scientists new insight into how these centrifuges work, which would be difficult to erase. You can't erase the knowledge in the minds of Iranian scientists. And there are also just aspects of quantity of nuclear material that Iran can continue to produce and ratchet up. So whether that is quantity of the 20%, of the 60-odd%, or even of the uranium metal. So these are all steps that Iran can take that can dial up pressure, and it's a very fine tool The Iranian political leadership can decide quite specifically what type of signal it wants to send, whether that's the type of machines it uses, the speed of the production, the quantity of the production, in order to send a message to the West about the degree of pressure it wants to put on. Why has it taken so long? I think part of it is the domestic political considerations in Iran. And part of it is, I think, an Iranian strategy to not want to appear desperate, to not appear overeager to get a deal. And I think we've seen, for example, in the Iranian reluctance to meet one-on-one with the American side, I think the Iranians are willing to accept the kind of delays that incurs, the kind of potential miscommunications in the negotiation, because of a broader issue where they do not want to concede on the point that the U.S. was the one that broke the deal, that withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions. Assuming we get back into the nuclear accord, I think it's going to be a very different environment than it was back in 2016, where you had Rouhani going to Europe, trying to get big deals with European multinationals, really going to battle with the Revolutionary Guards inside the country over making room for foreign investment, taking modest yet still significant strides on reforming the domestic business environment in terms of banking regulations and really pushing countering terrorist finance and money laundering legislation. I don't think an Ebrahim Raisi presidency is going to pursue any of that. I think the objective here is get back into the deal, get the economic benefits that it provides in terms of oil exports, access to international financial system, access to foreign exchange reserves frozen abroad, but nothing really when it comes to a broader economic opening.
And I'm joined live from Beirut in Lebanon by Yara Asma, who's a MENA region expert. Yara, thank you for joining us today here on The Edge. It's a pleasure to see you. Good evening. Good evening to you. The elections are being held right now today in Iran. The turnout is expected to be very low. Well, what are your impressions of expectations for today's elections?
First of all, up until now, the estimate of voters, of eligible voters, only 23% of the voters elected so far. And this is a very low turnout, definitely. But also before that, even government sources, they mentioned that it's not more than 34% or maximum 40%, it depends on the source, that from the eligible voters will be voting. The issue with this turnout is basically questioning the legitimacy of the president, that who will be elected and most probably will be Raisi. And this reflects the will of the Iranian people, and that the dynamics in Iran are changing. Usually in the elections, you have always this competition between, if we want to say, between the evil and the lesser evil, between a reformist or between a hardliner. This time, the Iranians do not have a choice. This time, the way was paved for Raisi to become a president. What will happen next is the most important part, not the results of the elections. The most important part is basically how the Iranian people will react to this kind of election, especially that they're going through a very hard socio-economic crisis, a political crisis, re-questioning the type of regime they live under, and an ecological crisis that is being transmitted through the excessive protests throughout the past few years.
Lots of things to break down here. But first of all, let me ask you, what is the significance of this position? Hassan Rouhani has been the president for the last 2 terms. How important is the president, and what role does he play? Well, what change can this bring about today?
Well, the presidency was during Rafsanjani time Rafsanjani wanted to make the presidency as the head of the executive, the person who would take decisions. Because back then Khamenei was considered to be a weak supreme leader. However, Khamenei proved them to be wrong. And the president now is basically has to be close to the supreme leader in order to be able to execute his agenda on the long run. And we saw in the previous interview we had it together, was about the leak of Jawad Zarif interview. And the main thing was, the discussion was like that the policy is in the hand of the Supreme Leader and of the IRGC. So in this sense, we see that the president is mostly like a tool to implement the policies of a bigger establishment that exists without him. But the results of this election, or basically the presidency of Raisi, is important in the sense of this, the next president is the potential candidate to become the next supreme leader of Iran. So basically, this president will be working closely with the current supreme leader to protect the supreme leadership, to create reforms, to realign the internal politics of Iran, especially realigning the components of the system represented by the clerks and the IRGC officers. So this is the importance of the presidency of Raisi. The presidency as such is an important role based on the constitution. However, the supreme leader has a greater role. And the more the supreme leader is powerful, he's able to influence the presidency.
So the big change that we can expect in the coming years, because Ayatollah Khamenei is 81 years old right now, so he's an old man. We can expect that position will change in a probably not too distant future.
Yeah, especially that also that a lot of reports came out on his health condition. So yeah.
So it's a critical moment in the Iranian timeline, so to speak. As you've mentioned, there's very low turnouts. There's a trending hashtag to boycott the Iranian elections, and many people are indeed boycotting them. Does this reflect the way that the people of Iran feel about their government? Do they feel distance from their leadership?
Yeah, definitely. The people of Iran feel distance from their leadership, especially with the sanctions that were implemented by the international sanctions on Iran, the socio-economic crisis, the inability of the establishment to contain the pandemic, to contain the COVID-19 outbreak in Iran. Now we have to look at the Iranian streets. Now we have to look at the reaction of the Iranian people inside Iran. The opposition outside Iran, they were like calling for boycotting elections, and they're lobbying for change. However, we're not sure how people inside Iran will mobilize themselves, how they will, if they will mobilize themselves and go to the street and demand for change. And what kind of change? What is the alternative? These are the big questions. Definitely the Iranians are not happy. They're not satisfied with the current status quo, but what's the alternative? It's like most of the countries in the region, people want change, but they're stuck because of the lack of another option, a better option.
So we can see that the opposition in Iran is something that almost doesn't exist because it's not allowed to exist. And yet,
I'm sorry, can I say something? The
Please.
opposition exists. The opposition exists in Iran.
Okay.
But the thing is that how flexible is the opposition now? How powerful is the opposition now to mobilize everyone?
So, okay, I was taking a stance too far off to one side, but so there is an opposition, but the opposition is effectively silenced or not allowed to participate. Maybe that's the more correct understanding. They're not allowed to participate because their candidates are taken away from them by the Selection Council. And yet, Ayatollah Khamenei said this morning, each vote counts, come and choose your president. But knowing that these people are already disenfranchised. So what can the opposition do to raise their voices, or is there a danger if they raise their voices for them?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question.
Is there a danger for them if they raise their voices? If they're not given a candidate to choose, does that mean that they're not allowed to call for a candidate for themselves?
There are many ways for the opposition to mobilize itself and to organize itself. We have to remember that Iran, the current regime in Iran, is the product of the revolution that happened in 1979. That's the main thing. The people were able to unite under one slogan or under one statement that they're against autocracy. And this is the one slogan that the opposition can unite behind. If a revolution is going to happen in Iran, the question in what shape, is the international community also interested in a revolution, in instability in Iran, because with everything happening in the region. There are different efforts. There are people inside Iran. There are people outside Iran. There's always constant communication. The role of social and digital media is helping a lot. And this is why Khamenei said many times that they need to go to vote. They call them for voting. So basically, the opposition outside Iran is being able to influence inside Iran. But what's the shape of the revolution? This is something that is not clear. The revolution can happen. Democracy can be established in Iran. However, on the long run, how to get rid of the also ruling elite, knowing that the IRGC is controlling the economy as well. This is the major question that we need like a whole interview, like for 2 hours to discuss it because of the different layers that exist.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that the leading candidate, so-called Ibrahim Raisi has said is that he's the best person to fight against this corruption and solve Iran's economic problems. I see you smile, so does that mean that you disagree with that?
Well, definitely I disagree with that. But his statement says something. His statement says that the moment I will come to power, there are people that will be gone. There are like head of institutions and officials in government. They will be disqualified or basically out of office. This can be part of his propaganda campaign, calling for like reforms, saying that we're working on fighting corruption within the Iranian institutions. But this is part of his plan to, as I mentioned before, to realign the institutions in Iran in his favor, especially if he's going to be the next supreme leader in Iran. So it's part of the rhetoric, definitely. This is what the people need to hear, that we want someone, I will be the person who will like save you from this economic crisis. The question is how. It's very difficult to understand how he will do that. But he will definitely be firing officials, changing officials, making reforms here and there. We saw it like in other autocratic regimes, like in Syria, like when Bashar al-Assad presented his bill of reforms for the Syrian people. This is part of the whole state propaganda, and this is it's not more than this.
Right. Liz, please stay with me, and we'll just have a look at this infographic. Iranians are voting today in their election amid concerns over low turnout. What are the reasons behind this? Let's have a look. So lots of problems in today's elections in Iran. I'm joined by Yara Asma still. Asma, so there are lots of reasons for the low turnout today, not least because of the boycott. Now, Ibrahim Raisi is touted as the leading candidate, and he and three others are described as hardliners. What do we mean by the term hardliner?
So basically, this is like kind of a differentiation that the international, or basically the international community created to separate between the group, the political group in Iran that is more prone to open to the West, to recalibrate the role of Iran in the region and in the world. These are more the reformists, but the hardliners are more like with an anti-American, anti-West rhetoric, committing to the values, the very core values of the revolution. This is the separation that is done by the international community. If it has to come to my opinion, and hearing it from Iranian friends saying that there's no separation between reformists and hardliners. At the end of the day, it's the same establishment. At the end of the day, the same security apparatus and the same supreme leader forcing and dictating policies and reshaping the fate of the Iranian people, whether they open to the West or whether they close to the West. So this is mostly like the hardliners are more prone to be anti-West and anti-globalization or anti-openness, not globalization, but anti-openness to the Americans and the West.
And they would be more supportive of ignoring something like the nuclear deal with the rest of the JCPOA. They would want to throw that out and continue to develop their nuclear program however they want to.
This is the projection, but in the presidential debate, Ibrahim expressed that he's willing to embrace the nuclear deal. But we don't know how he will embrace it. Now we don't know who's going to be his vice president. It's not like the American elections in this sense. Mm-hmm. How he will embrace it. He said, like, under the right circumstances. What are the right circumstances? There are projections that the deal might happen before even him assuming office. This is not clear yet, especially that if you remember in also previous interview, we talked that a deal might happen before even the elections. So nothing is clear yet on this thing. It's not like an impossible option for the EC to embrace the nuclear deal because Iran needs to open up. The devaluation of the currency is like I can relate it to the situation in our case in Lebanon. It's by the hour. The economic situation is very dire and the inflation is very high. And in order to get rid of the inflation, they need to print less money. And to print less money, they need to attract more hard currency. And it won't happen without a kind of openness to the West. And it can be under a renewal of the nuclear deal.
Now, unfortunately for him, one of the people that's blamed for this this depreciation of currency is the candidate that's described as more moderate, Abdulnasser Hemati. And he's, from my understanding, of the four candidates that remain today, might be the one which would be more popular amongst the people who don't support Raisi. Is that a right understanding? Because he was closer to Rouhani.
Well, basically, let's not forget that even the Iranians, when they were protesting the past few years, they were protesting against the government of Rouhani and against Rouhani as a president and the policies of Rouhani. So it's not about the popularity. It's about waiting to see how Raisi will move forward. There's a definite, like the turnout by itself reflects reflects the weak legitimacy of the presidency. It's not about the popularity anymore. The economic crisis is very dire to a point the people might need to take the street and ask for an alternative. Again, my personal opinion, there is no separation between reformist and hardliner, except this very, very thin nuance, the opening to the West or not. But I don't think there will be like a favorite person supported by the opposition or by like the people who do not like Raisi.
So I'm beginning to understand that this boycott is almost a silent revolution by not turning up to the polls. It's making a very strong political statement in itself. Is that the right way of looking at it?
Yeah, definitely. Because if we think about it, like you have this argument saying like if you want to change, you go to vote. But as you mentioned before, who are you voting for? Who chose your candidate? Who is the alternative? So this is definitely a silent revolution, and this definitely reflects the will of the Iranian people. And from this platform, I call for the international community to hear the will of the Iranian people. Iranian people are not the Iranian regime. They want change. They want to be reintegrated in this in the global system, in the international order. We should hear their voice by boycotting the elections.
I'm wondering what the international community can actually do with because there are advantages and disadvantages with an international community trying to get involved in domestic politics. Possibly you might look from a historical perspective and say that some of the problems in modern Iran are because of interference in the 1950s or whatever by the UK and by America in the political system then. So what can the international community actually do to help Iran move on?
Providing platform for the Iranian oppositions, and this platform like making people visible, talking about an Iranian opposition. Not only focusing on the regime and the practices of the regime through their proxies in the region of the Middle East. The Iranian opposition need to have a voice and a greater voice. And this is what the international community can provide. No one is calling for internal interference in Iran. This is a different thing. It's a matter of sovereignty. However, especially the people who are in exile, there's a reason why they're in exile. So they need this platform. Social media is helping a lot. But at the same time, the United Nations and the Human Rights Commission, they need to stick to these people. They need to make their voice louder.
Well, Yara, if you can stay with me, we're also joined now on the line from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates by Arash Azizi, who's an Iranian writer and historian at New York University. Arash, thank you for joining us today here on The Edge. You're joined with Yara Asmar. And we're going to have a look at a video together.
Thank you.
And after Iran's supreme rulers barred most of his rivals from the race to replace outgoing Hassan Rouhani, Ebrahim Raisi, a hardline judiciary chief, is running virtually uncontested in Iran's presidential election.
Ebrahim Raisi is the head of Iran's judiciary, one of the most powerful positions in government. The 60-year-old cleric is also seen as the most likely candidate to replace the 82-year-old Khamenei when he passes away. Raisi, like Khamenei, was born in the city of Mashhad in northeast Iran. He is an ultra-conservative Muslim cleric, though he does not hold the status of Ayatollah, the highest ranking for Shiite clergy. He attended the seminary in Qom and studied under some of Iran's most prominent clerics. His education was a point of contention in the debates, where he said he holds a doctorate in law and denied having only 6 grades of formal education. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, a young Raisi joined the prosecutor's office in Masjid Suleiman in southwestern Iran and later became the prosecutor for several jurisdictions. He moved to the capital, Tehran, in 1985 after being appointed deputy prosecutor. He served as Tehran's prosecutor, head of the General Inspection Organization, prosecutor general of the Special Court of the Clergy, and a deputy chief justice. Raisi ran in Iran's last presidential election in 2017, losing to President Hassan Rouhani, who secured a second 4-year term. Khamenei appointed Raisi to head of the judiciary in 2019, and he has tried to strengthen his position as a champion of fighting corruption by targeting insiders and holding public trials. while effectively beginning his presidential campaign early by travelling to nearly all of Iran's 32 provinces. Raisi has branded himself a rival to corruption, inefficiency and aristocracy, and has said he will uphold the nuclear deal as a state agreement, but believes a strong government is needed to steer it in the right direction.
Thank you for staying with me. Arash, I'd like to come to you first. What's your take on today's elections?
It's great to be with you and with Yara. Look, I mean, the elections are what we see very clearly, that as had been predicted for a long time, the turnout was very low. We can see there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. And actually, even if you look at the declared numbers so far, the polls haven't closed. Ridiculously enough, they said they're ready to keep the polls closed until 2 a.m., which I don't know whether it's a Guinness, sort of record or not. But even the declared numbers in many provinces, you see that the turnout is very low. And everything in the last few days, the resignation of Jalili, who was the only other notable candidate, and the lukewarm support for Hemmati, the main centrist candidate, and the fact that even when big names such as President Khatami and Karoubi came to support Hemmati, it has not translated into the popular support for him, shows what we have known for a very long time. This is not a real election in many senses, but a coronation, effectively, of Ayatollah Raisi, who's been corolled into the presidency without, for the first time since 1994, without having gone through a competitive electoral process.
So today's election is really a funneling down to this is who you're going to elect. Why is it that in the last few days 3 of the 7 selected candidates dropped out?
Well, the Conservatives effectively dropped out in order to open the space for Raisi to win in the first round, because if his vote would have been under 50%, it would have gone to the second round. So that's why. And Mehraliza, the reformist candidate, resigned to boost up the chances of Hemmati, who is, of course, a different guy and who has different politics. He's a centrist. But the reason that he has not been able to enthuse people to go out and vote for him is that President Rouhani was not really able to do much of his agenda. Many of people who voted for him.
So, Yara, let me ask you. We're talking very much as if Raisi is going to win today. Does this seem like the certain outcome? Sorry, Yara, I don't know if you can hear me. Today is beset with technical problems. Yara, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, now you're back.
Can you hear me? Super. The wonder of live television and technology. We're talking very much as though with all these candidates dropping out and the massaging of who's on the ticket for the vote today, it seems almost certain that Ebrahim Raisi is going to be the winning candidate today. Is that a correct prediction?
Like in elections, you cannot have like a 100% answer to who's going to win, even in Iran. But most probably yes.
So, as you say, that nothing is certain until it's over. But how will the international community react to that? Do you think?
Like there are many stages now. Like when the president will assume the office, this is the first stage. We will have to look at the internal politics of Iran, what will happen in the street, how the reaction of the people, and at the same time there are ongoing negotiations in Vienna. What will be the policies of Raisi presidency towards the negotiations, especially towards the United States and and Europe on this level. So there's no like clear answer on how the reaction of the international community will be. Now the reaction is mostly on the manipulation of the elections, on the choice of the candidates, and on like the disqualification of like major reformist and opponents candidates to Raisi.
Now, Arash, Iran has been in many ways disengaged from the rest of the world, or from many of particularly the Western countries for many years, and it's been a very conflictual relationship. Is the way that this election has been conducted, or perceived to be conducted, going to harden that attitude, do you think? And what can be done to bring Iran back into a more friendly relationship with the rest of the world?
Look, we're not going to see a lot of change in foreign policy or international direction of the government following this change in many senses. Of course, I'm talking about a sort of more long-term perspective. There will be some immediate changes. There will be some sort of very obvious sort of cosmetic changes. Javad Zarif is someone who is, who has really made his business to be one who sort of negotiates with the West. But I think it's actually very likely that Ayatollah Raisi will also pick someone who is, maybe he will appoint Abbas Araghchi, Zarif's current deputy, as foreign minister, or someone of the same hue, and that he wouldn't necessarily go for a hardliner for foreign minister, or appoint different diplomats in sort of ad hoc positions to continue negotiations with the West. On the key issue, on the key issue of negotiations with the West, they're very likely that they would continue. The talks in Vienna might even reach a result before Raisi takes office in August, and then afterwards they'll continue in different ways. Now, Iran already had very little democratic legitimacy, the Iranian regime, as far as it's concerned. So as to what will happen now, we have to see. But let's just remember some facts. The new president is one who has taken a leading and direct part in an unabashed crime against humanity by his role in the 1988 massacre in Iranian prisons, where thousands of Iranian political prisoners were killed. And Ayatollah Raisi was a member of the death panel, the panel of death of 4 people who sentenced these people to death. So many lower people who have had a role in this crime against humanity have been prosecuted in Sweden, for example. So here's a guy who is an ultra criminal with very little democratic legitimacy. Now, what that means for Iranian regime's reception in the world, we're going to have to see the specifics of. But as for the question of, in the Iranian foreign policy establishment, there have always been a wing that prioritizes relations with the West and a wing that prioritizes relations with Russia and China. It is true that we see more support for the latter, for the second wing, the pro-Russian China wing. But whether they'll be able to actually wrest control of the foreign policy apparatus or not is something that we're going to have to wait and watch. At any rate, these decisions are not taken by Raisi. They're taken by Ayatollah Khamenei, who is 82 and not dead yet. And as long as he's alive, he's the one who will make those calls. And yeah.
But as we were discussing earlier, the upcoming president will be the supreme leader in waiting, almost. But Ibrahim Raisi is under US sanctions at the moment. This is going to present a very interesting relationship for the United States to have a president under sanction going forward. As Arash has pointed out, his humanitarian rights record is something to be shocked at. This is going to make it very difficult, I imagine, for relations to develop in a positive way.
Yeah, definitely. But at the same time, we have to see where the negotiations of the nuclear deal will go. Like the Biden administration is very adamant on renegotiating and reestablishing the 2015 Iranian deal. And if this goes in the right direction, then definitely there will be more openness towards the Raisi and his presidency. And I think Arash can elaborate more on this point and on the issue of the negotiations. However, I think that the moment the Iranian deal is established and is embraced by the presidency, there will be different ways of communication with the Iranian regime, with the current and with the current or like the futurely elected president.
In fact, I want to throw that back to Arash. Just 2 days ago, after talking to the Russian President Putin, Joe Biden said that the United States would never be involved in interfering with any elections. As we were talking with Yara earlier, that's not quite the case, because back in the 50s, the US and the UK were involved in massaging the Iranian politics. So what influence could or should the Western powers or the international community have on Iran's domestic politics?
Well, yes, of course, the United States has been involved in so many elections in history that, the historian and me could speak a couple of hours about, about all the electoral processes in which the United States has intervened. And
despite them denying it, of course.
That's right. And of course, whatever policies the United States have will affect Iranian politics. Always has, always will. At least as long as the United States and Iran are so central to each other's politics. Now, as a question of what should President Biden do, that's a very good one. And I think the answer is not easy. And unfortunately, in DC, you have a lot of loud people who like to pretend this is easy or to push one way or the other. The United States can't make Iran democratic overnight or over a few nights, nor can it do some magic. But what it can do, I believe, is I think the return to a nuclear deal would probably be good news, at least in some short term. But we're going to have to see what it means. I think the sanctions have been a inhumane and bad policy. They've been bad for people, but they've been also bad for politics. They've basically strengthened the hardliners. I think what the United States needs to do in long term is a few things together. They need to support civil society in Iran. They need to continue supporting civil society and civil society initiatives in Iran. They need to face the reality that this is not this regime, it is clear what it is. It is a anti-democratic, really anti-humanistic, if you will, regime that has, no pretension of democracy or of rule of law or of, any of the sort of liberal values that President Biden certainly was elected on. So it needs to be clear about what's the nature of this regime, support human rights and civil society in Iran, but also prioritize policies, tough policies at each point, that strengthen those Democrats basically in Iran and civil society in Iran. And it's not clear or easy what those policies are at each term. So we're going to have to see what kind of a President Raisi is going to be. But I think certainly economic deprivation of Iranians has not been good for progressive politics or for democratic politics.
So it's time.
That's the very reason.
So it's time for Iran to have a fresh breath of fresh air. Unfortunately, it looks like that won't come today, but we're avidly waiting to see what the results of today's elections are. Thank you both for joining me today here on The Edge. Arash Azizi, Yara Asma, thank you for helping us join the technical gremlins. We'll talk to you again. Now, our two analysts have provided an insight into Iran's presidential election. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. No matter what the outcome of this election is, the president will have the massive responsibility, the Iran nuclear deal, and has to deal with the economy and the international pressure on Iran. That's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boyns. Stay tuned as we'll be back next time with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.